Hi there. My name is Ruth Miller, and I am the managing editor at Portal Center Press. And I am delighted to be here today because I get to introduce my good friend and co-author, Milt Markewitz. And we've written a couple of books together that Portal Center Press has published, and they both have to do with a very important idea. And that idea is that if we want to understand and perhaps even begin to turn around the problems that we're dealing with in the world, the climate change and other problems, we need to get in touch with what it is that Indigenous people understand. Now, these are people who have been living comfortably on this earth for hundreds of thousands of years, using different kinds of ideas and different ways of talking about things and different ways of thinking about things than we have. Now, our first book came out a few years ago, and that was The Language of Life. And The Language of Life began to get in touch with how ancient Hebrew was one of those languages and could make a very tremendous difference, I felt, and I think Milt does too, in how we understand ourselves and our world. Well, I asked Milt to do a second edition of this book because it's been a few years. And it turns out things have changed and he has changed and all kinds of new information is available. So we actually have a new book. It builds on The Language of Life, but it isn't the same. So we're calling this one To Restore Earth's Balance, Awakening and Already Knowing. And Milt will tell you where that phrase comes from. And what we're looking at is the wisdom of earth-based languages in helping us deal with today's world problems. So, Milt, hi.
Hi. Nice
I'm
to be here.
so glad you're with us. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share how it is that you got interested in this idea in the first place. You know, what brings you to this whole set of concepts and ideas?
Okay. Um, well, I first of all, in my background, I worked for IBM, which is a pretty mechanically oriented company, and people wonder how I made this switch. But I also had the very good fortune of working with other cultures,
Hmm.
and one of them was the Japanese, and got into a situation where it became very clear that they could see the manufacturing process as a living process.
Mm.
And that opened up a lot of eyes for me, that cultures really did think differently, see the world differently, and came out with much different results. So when I retired from IBM, I did get interested in education uh, and learning organizations and so forth, which I think set a little bit of a background. But mostly, I really got involved with seeing the world as renewable.
Mm.
How could we be sustainable? In essence, kind of a Western term, sustainable.
Hmm.
Um, but I found out from two things really: doing this renewability work and listening to Indigenous people, that it was really the Indigenous people that had the only message that made sense to me. And the sustainability piece opened up this whole world that said, if I'm going to do this work, I have to understand how living systems flourish. This whole world of living systems, and it flourishes. And I need to understand that. And so that was kind of my introduction. I went back to Antioch in Seattle, a whole systems design program, and my curriculum was pretty much all around living systems. And we taught living systems to our cohort, and were graced by Fridtjof Capra as a co-teacher that day.
Hmm.
And so we talked about living systems as cleansing and healing and restructuring so that life would always flourish, that all life had these attributes, and and to see things more in terms of process and emergence. It wasn't about goals and objectives and so on and so forth.
Oh, wow.
So here we go. And Fridtjof was so wonderful to work with. He just kind of dropped this bomb on our heads and didn't really articulate it, and said, all life is endowed with life processes. And
Aha.
I knew this was important, but he didn't really expound on it. It wasn't really part of what we taught. But I was reading a book called The Cipher of Genesis at the time. A friend of mine had given it to me. And it's looking at what the ancient Hebrews thought the scriptures, how the scriptures read.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about what Fridtjof said, and I'm wondering, does this book have these life processes in it? And lo and behold, there's a 1-page 3x9 matrix with 9 life processes and 3 energies. So the life processes are things like we are all endowed. There you go.
Mm-hmm.
All endowed with a being part of a life-death life-death continuum. And we've been blessed with perfect order, and we recreate our species with integrity, so that organic life, all organic life does. And there's a universal life that we're all in this dance together. And there's possibility and there's energy. And I'll describe that as 3x9 matrix a little bit, and you'll understand the energy. And I think maybe the most important, I shouldn't say that, very important, is that we are all attracted to what we need to be attracted to. That love is an integral part of life.
Woo!
It's not an emotion, as
Mm-hmm.
we describe it in the West.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that our emotions are either because we have love or we have a lack of love.
Nice.
But love itself is there.
Mm-hmm.
So and the three rows are incredible. The first row that intrigues me the most is the cosmological force that created each of these life processes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And
the
this
second
is what we
row,
spend a lot of time with in this book, right?
exactly. And that led me to believe that people who speak these languages intuit all that's necessary to create and sustain life.
Got it.
So that's
So then that draws us to this book. I got it.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one other piece of that matrix. Let me just explain those 3 energies
Sure.
to people so they'll get them. The first is this cosmological energy that creates the life process. The second energy is a nurturing. It's called archetypal, but it's the energy that nurtures that life process.
Mm-hmm.
And the third energy is what we experience in that life process.
Nice.
It's beautiful. It's really powerful.
And as I recall from this book, you identified some words that were the embodiment of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And they take you even further. They show you that there's a transformational possibility in the language so that people recognize what we do on Earth will actually change the cosmological force. And the cosmological force obviously affects what we experience on Earth. But if we look at just the word Baruch, which means blessed or blessing, that cosmological interplay is, the interplay is happening, and we can see that what we're doing, how we're ravaging the Earth, is affecting this cosmological force.
That's powerful stuff. And just for our audience, Baruch in Hebrew is what has been translated into the Lord's Prayer is hallowed, hallowed. It's blessed to a very high degree, if you will.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So anyway, we're on this path now, and I'm working with the indigenous people, and I have a colleague and a mentor, Valerian Merkuliev, who is Yunangan Aleut, and he was really instrumental in helping me understand that that we in the Western world need to ask the right questions.
Mm-hmm.
We need to understand what is at the root of our problems,
Mm-hmm.
and to recognize that it was separation from Earth. And I asked him how long ago this happened. He said 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. My belief is
that's where my work began to come into play.
Exactly. This is the time of empire.
Mm-hmm.
And so we follow that thread and we go like, well, what happened during empire?
Mm-hmm.
How did the word radah in Hebrew, which means dominion as a realm,
right,
turned into dominion over and then domination?
Nice.
right?
Nice.
How did this language, which just had you appreciating life at the greatest level, get turned in from original blessing to original sin?
Nice.
All of these things were happening in this hierarchy with these hierarchical institutions until we got where we are today with this incredibly ethical shortfall.
Hmm.
Because we wouldn't have wars and we wouldn't have social injustice and we wouldn't have climate change if we had the correct ethics.
Right. And by ethics, and this is a huge part of what you're talking about in the parts you've written in this. By ethics, you're not just talking about a standard of good behavior. You're talking about much more than that. It's a lot deeper than that. And that's one of the things that I think the readers will greatly appreciate here is that reframing of what we have been taught, to be ethical is to follow the rules, basically. And you're saying, no, it's a lot more than that.
Right. And I think it boils down to looking at our ethics and asking the question, do we have earth-based ethics? Are they part of our Constitution? Those are our guiding principles for the country. Are they
Right.
part of our religions? That's where we look for ethical guidance. And the
Right.
answer is basically no. It's not.
Right.
And
There
so, of
are a
course, we
few
have this
church
problem.
organizations in the US that have taken on, an environmental ethic or an earth-based or an earth-focused ethic within the Christian tradition. And I know there are some within the Judaic tradition, but basically the Abrahamic, the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions say, no, earth is an object out there and not something that we are part of and need to be relating with. And that's a huge part of your message, I think.
It is. That's a huge part and working on. And I won't say anything more about, well, I will say just one thing more. I mean, currently, I'm pretty active with the United Religions Initiative. They have over 1,000 cooperation circles all over the world. And we're raising this Indigenous message, not with the idea of just trying to bring a social justice change, but with the idea of having them recognize that here's a process orientation for life. And in fact, let me say one more thing about this, is to step back a moment. And that is when Einstein said the consciousness that creates a problem isn't sufficient for solving it,
Yes.
that in essence was a replay of a Hopi teaching.
Love it. Love it.
And the Hopi basically said that if you move from one consciousness to another consciousness and you want to move back to that first consciousness, then you have to embody that consciousness. And that is so important, because if in fact you were to go to virtually any culture, I think, and say that we need to change consciousness, people would just throw up their hands.
Right.
What else do I have? But if you were to say we need to revert back to a consciousness that's already been lived, then there's possibility, real possibility. So how do we make that embodiment possible? And that's really the next step. Because when I look and I say, like I mentioned before, when we wrote the first book, that that there are peoples, cultures that intuited what it is to be to create and sustain life.
Yes.
And I had a friend that looked at the Hebrew language, the matrix, says, Milt, this will help people understand that they don't know what they don't know. And I said, that's exactly right. So the big challenge here, in addition to the ethics then, is how do we create bridges? And this is a big part of the work. When I work with kids, I teach them, these are the attributes of living systems. These are the energies that are there in the living language. And they actually shift. This is in one class period, and it's replicable. It's happened over and over again. They shift from the highest meme in our culture, which is social justice, to wanting to their life work to be around indigenous, earth-based principles, basically. what I do is teach them the attributes of living systems, the endowments of living systems, the notion that those people who are tied to the earth have a concept of sufficient abundance, that the earth will always provide as long as you meet your mutual responsibilities. And then we go through an exercise that's written up in the book there, and we see them shift from from their current way of being, which is basically a social justice, community activities, to wanting their life work to be around earth-based ways of being, and they 100% sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you know, and when I read that, when you wrote that in the book and I was reading it, and as we were putting it all together, I was realizing that if I think of any, 4 to 8-year-old that I know, they would automatically go there. It wouldn't occur to them not to go there. And then in the 8 to 15, 16, they'd have to think about it for a little bit, but they end up there too. It's really fascinating. And I love the way you describe that whole process in this book. It's wonderful. Not only with the children, but with adults, you provide the bridge. You keep offering ways we can bridge. And so we have what Copra and you were working with the systems thinking and thinking about living systems and seeing these processes that are ongoing and renewing and recreating. And then you mentioned a few moments ago when you were talking about how the kids shift, from social justice, which you said was the highest meme. And that's an important concept that you bring into the book, the concept of memes of groups and people where we can be in our thinking. And meme is an interesting word because it's the equivalent of gene in our thoughts, right? It's a wonderful word. I love the word. And then the bridging of appreciative inquiry, because as you said a few moments ago, the original languages are full of praise and appreciation for what is, right? Whereas in Empire, we got into this control and complain, if you will, form of communication. And so the appreciative inquiry. So, what you've done and what I attempted to support in my contributions is provide a way that we can bridge and learn how to go from a mindset that says we're dominating this world, we're here to make it be what we want it to be, we're here to control nature, which has gotten us where we are, to a different way of being in the world that allows us to maybe turn this around. So if I were, Mary housewife or Joe businessman, and I'm attempting to make my life work, can you see how this book might be helpful?
Well, yes, it includes everyone. All of us have to raise our ethical understanding and infuse or embody this earth-based wisdom. These have to be our guiding principles. And I think there's one other shift, and I don't know whether the average person is going to buy into this right away, but I think it's very, very important. And that is that you shouldn't be listening to me. You need to be listening to the indigenous people speak their messages. And I found this out. I did a class for the community college up here in Hood River, and it was canceled because of COVID. And I had lined up indigenous speakers for every session except 2. And I thought, I'm just going to keep the same dates, do a webinar and so forth. Now, the school thought we'd have maybe 10 people or so. We got online with it, and we immediately had 25 or 30. Once the indigenous voices began to be heard, we were soon up to 105 people.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful.
And people were saying things like, I grew up with Native kids, a fellow from Walla Walla, and I worked with them off and on in my work. And I learned more in an hour with the gentleman Jefferson Green from Warm Springs than I had learned in all of that time.
And some of it was his listening. He was prepared to hear where before he probably wasn't. Is that something you think you could replicate if our listeners are in a position where they could maybe get a group together? Do you think you could create something like that again?
Oh, yeah, I think we have to. I think
Well
we have
done.
to. Because,
Well
and
done.
what I think is happening is when I deal with Indigenous people, like my friend Ilarion that I mentioned, his
Yes.
people, the Unangan, and this is in the book, were slaves to the U.S. government until the mid-60s. His father worked
And
16
that's going to
plus
be hard for a lot of our listeners to accept that we,
right.
that our government enslaved people. Yeah.
But his father worked 16 plus hours a day killing seal pups so that we could make money off of the pelts and so forth. And one day that was exposed. The US government pulled out very quickly. And there they were stuck in a basically company town where the company had governed everything, the housing, the schooling, the food, the discipline, so on and so forth. And one of the things that Ilarion talks about in that is that they made a decision to do everything the native way, everything. So for me, that was so intriguing because how they listen and how they speak to each other, how they make decisions, how they view their science, how they teach their children, how they create elders. Hell, you and I are elders by age.
Oh my goodness.
Elders.
And again, you were able to lay this story out in beautiful detail in the book.
But I think if we start hearing these stories, because they're everywhere, everywhere, there's half a dozen just in Portland, I'm absolutely convinced,
Yes.
of things, challenges that were taken on by the Native community without two nickels to rub together most of the time.
Right. And because of that thought process and that understanding, they were able to pull it off.
Exactly.
Yeah. I love it.
We really have to get tuned into that and elevate that message. And it's difficult for us because for several hundred years, we've operated off that domination. So we as colonizers are also colonized.
And that's an odd thing for people to get. And hopefully, through the book and through listening to these people, we can begin to understand that.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
So that really is the work. And then, of course, in the end, infusing all of that wisdom into the masses.
That's what we're doing here.
That is what we're doing here. And then I think about people like 350.org and, people that climate change, the climate change march, the women's march, the peace marches, so on and so forth. We have the ability to actually get messages out to large numbers of people who then self-organize into these other, and I think doing that with earth-based values, we really didn't mention that this work really needs to be done in a fairly urgent way, but without making mistakes, because we don't have time to make mistakes. And I think that if we get back to that beginning and just kind of go through that flow again, that embedding those ethics in our government, in our business, in our schools, in our religions, and so forth, will shift masses of people.
Absolutely.
And the decisions that will be made and the past decisions that are so hurtful will begin to be undone more and more.
Yeah.
So I don't know, for me, that's what the work's about, Ruth, and I'm certainly glad that you and I are doing this together.
Well, it's been an honor to work with you on this process, and to some extent eye-opening, because I, like everyone else, I get caught up in my little sphere and I stop. I don't take the time to go out into that other sphere, and you're bringing that in and reminding me and reminding us all that there is a way we know in our hearts to be and can be that we've been trained not to be anymore. A huge part of the culture we are in is to program people not to follow their inner guidance, not to follow their hearts, not to, that's a huge part of this culture, this empire culture, as I call it. And if we can begin to do as you're suggesting, replace that programming with that deeper knowing that is present in all of us, and live from that deeper knowing, you know, things are going to change. And one of the points you made early on in this interview that I love is that the cosmological power affects our individual experience, but our individual experience affects the cosmological. And if we can accept that possibility, then we don't have to be quite so afraid of the kinds of changes we think we might have to make, and are we going to be able to, and all of that. If we can get into the place where we're allowing the way that the cosmological process unfolds to unfold in its normal way, instead of to continually block it with the ways that our empire culture has trained us to block it, these changes are going to happen much more smoothly, much more quickly, and we will find radical shifts very, very immediately. I'm convinced. So that's part of why I put the effort into getting this book out, and that's why I'm doing this to help promote it. And I'm really looking forward to how the ideas are received in the world, and whether it's through the book directly or through, you know, what Rupert Sheldrake calls the morphogenetic field.
Exactly.
That the book and the interview and the conversations are creating, that make it more readily available, these ideas more readily available to more people everywhere, whether they even speak American English or not, or read or anything. Yeah.
I think it's interesting you bring up Rupert Sheldrake and the morphic field, and there is an implicate order. And once you understand the language, you understand that. And I think the other thing that folks may really want to know is that for me, doing this work, as it happened, I know when I showed the first book to a native elder, Navajo, he said, you know, Milt, for me, when we speak our language, it's like awakening and already knowing.
Yeah.
And
that is so beautiful.
And that's where the subtitle came from for the book, because I was feeling, as I was doing this work, that it was awakening and already knowing in me. Not something that could be taught out of books or whatever, but internal, you know, that there was an internal truth about it that just resonated. And I think the same thing happened with the students. I really felt like it wasn't my teachings, it was the resonant, that awakening and already knowing. And it can happen with everyone.
Yeah, they already know it. It's already in them. Yes. So we did create a web page for people who want to be in contact with you, and that's on the GaiaLivingSystems.org site, which is about sustainability and has many, many resources. And then there is a page that is the Awakening Knowing page. And that has a contact form for reaching you, and through you, me, if necessary. And also has a whole bunch of the resources. You know, we did the book as both an ebook and a print book. And the ebook has all kinds of links. Now, the links are all listed in the back of the print book, but you have to copy them. On the ebook, you just link on them and click on them. So it's available in both formats. Thank you, Milt, so much for doing this, for doing this video with me, for being who you are in the world, for bringing the wisdom of your inner knowing to all that you do. It's such a treat and such an honor to work with you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a lovely, lovely time.